Imagine meeting someone who proudly owns Bitcoin today. They speak confidently about scarcity, decentralization, and the future of money. They explain why they believe Bitcoin matters with the certainty of someone who has spent years studying it. You might assume they believed in Bitcoin from the very beginning, but there's a surprising truth that rarely gets discussed. A remarkable number of today's Bitcoin believers were once among its loudest critics. Some called it a scam. Some laughed at the idea of internet money. Others insisted it would eventually become worthless. Many confidently predicted its death more than once. Yet today, some of those same people hold Bitcoin in their portfolios, advocate for it publicly, or even dedicate their careers to studying it. What changed? Was it Bitcoin? Or was it something happening much deeper inside the human mind? The answer begins with a psychological truth that has nothing to do with finance. Human beings rarely reject new ideas because they carefully analyze them. More often, they reject ideas because those ideas threaten an existing worldview. Every person carries an invisible mental map explaining how the world works. This map is built over decades through education, culture, family, news, personal experiences, and social expectations. Once that map feels complete, the brain becomes extremely protective of it. Changing your worldview is expensive, not financially, mentally. The brain prefers stability over uncertainty because stability saves energy. If every new idea forced us to rebuild our understanding of reality, we would never stop questioning everything around us. Evolution rewarded brains that could make quick assumptions and stick with them. This tendency helped our ancestors survive. But in the modern world, it sometimes prevents us from recognizing revolutionary change. Bitcoin creates exactly this kind of conflict. Most people grow up believing that money comes from governments. Banks keep it safe. Central banks manage the economy. Inflation is simply part of life. Currencies have value because governments say they do. Whether these beliefs are completely true or only partially true isn't the important point. The important point is that they become the invisible foundation upon which our understanding of money is built. Then Bitcoin appears. Suddenly, someone claims that money doesn't need a government. It doesn't require a central bank. It can exist purely through mathematics, cryptography, distributed consensus, and voluntary participation. Immediately, the brain encounters a problem. Accepting Bitcoin isn't simply accepting a new investment. Accepting Bitcoin may require questioning decades of assumptions about economics, trust, institutions, and even history itself. That is psychologically uncomfortable. Most people underestimate just how powerful this discomfort can be. The brain often treats challenges to deeply held beliefs as if they were physical threats. This isn't just a metaphor. Neuroscientists have observed that social and ideological threats can activate many of the same emotional systems involved in physical danger. When our worldview is challenged, we instinctively defend it, not because we're dishonest, because our brains are trying to protect our sense of certainty. That's why many skeptics don't begin by asking, could Bitcoin actually work? Instead, they begin with, why this can't possibly work? Notice the difference. One question searches for truth. The other searches for confirmation. This is where one of psychology's most powerful forces quietly takes control. Confirmation bias. Human beings naturally seek information that supports what they already believe, while filtering out information that contradicts those beliefs. If someone believes Bitcoin is a scam, they immediately notice every exchange collapse, every market crash, every hacking incident, and every negative headline. When Bitcoin falls 70%, they say, I knew it. When another country bans Bitcoin, they nod confidently. When a famous investor criticizes it, they feel validated. But something interesting happens. They rarely spend the same amount of energy examining the opposite evidence. They don't notice that Bitcoin continues operating every single day without interruption. They overlook the fact that blocks continue to be mined roughly every 10 minutes, regardless of market panic. They ignore growing institutional participation. They dismiss technological improvements. They underestimate the significance of people voluntarily choosing Bitcoin across completely different cultures and political systems. The brain isn't being objective. It's protecting an existing conclusion. Another invisible psychological force makes this process even stronger: the desire to belong. Human beings are social creatures long before we become rational thinkers. Throughout most of history, surviving depended on remaining accepted by the tribe. Being rejected by the group could literally mean death. Although modern society has changed dramatically, our brains still carry those ancient instincts. Most people don't form opinions in complete isolation. Instead, they unconsciously absorb the opinions of those around them. If family members dismiss Bitcoin, if television experts ridicule it, if coworkers laugh about people buying digital coins, if respected professors call it speculation, then rejecting Bitcoin feels safe. Agreeing with everyone else creates emotional comfort. Disagreeing creates psychological risk. This explains why skepticism toward Bitcoin often spreads socially rather than intellectually. People inherit skepticism before they investigate Bitcoin themselves. Few people read the Bitcoin white paper before deciding what they think about Bitcoin. Most form opinions after reading headlines, or watching television, or hearing jokes, or repeating what someone else confidently claimed. The opinion comes first. The research often never arrives. But time has an unusual way of exposing weak assumptions. Imagine hearing in 2012 that Bitcoin would disappear within months. Then it survives. You hear again in 2014 that it's finished forever. It survives again. Another crash arrives, another obituary is written, another prediction declares Bitcoin dead. Yet somehow it continues, year after year, cycle after cycle. Critics may celebrate every price collapse, but an uncomfortable question slowly begins forming in the background. If this thing truly has no value, why won't it die? That question is dangerous. Because once genuine curiosity enters the conversation, certainty begins losing its grip. Psychologists describe another fascinating phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. This occurs when reality repeatedly conflicts with existing beliefs. Suppose someone has confidently believed for 10 years that Bitcoin is worthless. But during those same 10 years, major companies begin holding Bitcoin. Publicly traded firms add it to their balance sheets. Institutional products emerge. Entire industries grow around it. Millions of people voluntarily participate. Developers continue improving the ecosystem. Countries debate regulation rather than disappearance. Reality keeps refusing to cooperate with the original belief. At first, the skeptic explains everything away. It's temporary. It's just speculation. It will collapse next year. But after hearing the same explanation for years, something subtle begins happening. The explanation itself starts feeling less convincing. Not because someone forced them to change their mind, because reality keeps applying pressure. Every year Bitcoin survives becomes another small crack in the old mental model. Notice something important here. Most skeptics don't suddenly become believers because Bitcoin reaches a certain price. Price attracts attention, but persistence changes psychology. Anyone can dismiss a short-lived trend. It's much harder to dismiss something that refuses to disappear despite enormous criticism. Longevity creates credibility, not instantly, gradually, almost invisibly. Another obstacle, however, still remains, perhaps the most difficult one of all: the human ego. Imagine spending years publicly mocking Bitcoin. You've told friends it's foolish. You've laughed at investors. You've argued online. You've predicted collapse repeatedly. Now imagine discovering that perhaps you were wrong. Admitting that mistake isn't easy, because changing your opinion now feels like admitting weakness. Ironically, the more publicly someone attacked Bitcoin, the harder it becomes for them to reconsider it. Their identity becomes attached to the criticism itself. The conversation stops being about Bitcoin. It becomes about protecting pride. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as identity protection. People defend beliefs because those beliefs become part of who they think they are. Changing the belief feels like losing a piece of themselves. This is why evidence alone rarely changes minds. Facts matter, but identity often matters more. Eventually, however, something unexpected begins happening. The skeptic notices that intelligent people they respect are quietly studying Bitcoin. Not everyone is chasing quick profits. Some are economists, some are engineers, some are mathematicians, some are entrepreneurs, some simply ask thoughtful questions. Suddenly, the stereotype becomes harder to maintain. Perhaps Bitcoin supporters aren't all irrational speculators. Perhaps there's more to understand. That tiny possibility changes everything, because curiosity is psychologically different from agreement. A skeptic doesn't need to become a believer overnight. They only need to ask one honest question. What if I've misunderstood this? That question marks the beginning of one of the most fascinating transformations in modern finance. The person who once searched only for reasons Bitcoin would fail begins searching for reasons millions of people continue believing in it. The goal quietly shifts. They're no longer trying to prove Bitcoin wrong. They're trying to understand why it refuses to disappear. They haven't bought a single Satoshi yet. They may still be deeply skeptical. They may still disagree with many Bitcoin advocates. But internally, something profound has already changed. The walls of certainty have begun to crack. And once certainty begins giving way to genuine curiosity, the journey toward a first Bitcoin purchase has already started, even if the skeptic doesn't realize it yet. Something fascinating happens after curiosity replaces certainty. The loud debates begin to disappear. The sarcastic jokes become less frequent. The confident predictions that Bitcoin is about to die suddenly become less convincing, even to the skeptic making them. Nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. Yet beneath that surface, an invisible psychological shift has already begun. This is usually the moment when people assume skeptics experience fear of missing out. FOMO. It's one of the most overused explanations in the entire Bitcoin conversation. But the real story is much more interesting. Most skeptics don't buy their first Bitcoin because they suddenly dream of becoming rich. They buy because they become increasingly uncomfortable with one unsettling possibility. What if I've been wrong all this time? That question is emotionally far more powerful than greed. Because admitting that you misunderstood an investment is one thing. Admitting that you misunderstood the nature of money itself is something entirely different. Every year Bitcoin continues existing, the cost of ignoring it quietly increases. Not only financially, intellectually. Imagine watching the same phenomenon survive for 15 or 20 years despite thousands of predictions of its collapse. Eventually, skepticism begins demanding more effort than curiosity. At first, dismissing Bitcoin requires almost no work. You simply repeat what everyone else says. It's backed by nothing. It has no intrinsic value. Governments will ban it. It wastes energy. It's too volatile. But eventually, those familiar arguments begin colliding with an increasingly complicated reality. Bitcoin isn't disappearing. Developers continue improving it. Companies continue studying it. Governments stop asking whether Bitcoin exists and begin asking how to regulate it. Financial institutions that once laughed at Bitcoin begin offering products connected to it. Even critics slowly change their language. Years earlier, they claimed Bitcoin would vanish. Now they argue that Bitcoin exists but is overvalued. Notice the subtle shift. The argument quietly moved from existence to valuation. That alone reveals something important. Reality has already forced the conversation to evolve, and the skeptic notices this, even if they never admit it aloud. Psychologists sometimes describe a threshold where curiosity finally becomes stronger than resistance. For years, skepticism sits comfortably above curiosity. Then, almost without warning, the lines cross. One evening, the skeptic decides to read the Bitcoin white paper, not because they've become a believer, because they realize they've criticized something they've never actually studied. That moment is surprisingly common. Many longtime Bitcoin owners describe discovering that most of what they believed about Bitcoin came from headlines rather than primary sources. For the first time, they encounter concepts that mainstream conversations rarely explain. Digital scarcity, proof of work, difficulty adjustment, the fixed supply, decentralized consensus, game theory. Suddenly, Bitcoin no longer appears to be merely a digital coin whose price moves up and down. It begins looking like an entirely different way of coordinating trust between strangers. The skeptic may still disagree with Bitcoin's future, but they can no longer honestly claim it's intellectually empty. This realization often produces another psychological surprise. People begin recognizing the difference between understanding something and agreeing with it. Before studying Bitcoin, many skeptics confuse those two ideas. They assume that learning about Bitcoin somehow means joining a movement. In reality, understanding and agreeing are completely different processes. Ironically, the deeper someone studies Bitcoin, the more nuanced their opinion usually becomes. Blind enthusiasm decreases. Blind skepticism also decreases. The conversation becomes more thoughtful. And then comes perhaps the most important psychological moment of all, the first purchase. Curiously, this purchase is almost never dramatic. Movies would have us believe that skeptics eventually wake up one morning, sell everything they own, and move their entire savings into Bitcoin. Reality is almost always much quieter. Most people buy an amount so small that losing it wouldn't meaningfully change their lives. $50, $100, perhaps $500. Not because they suddenly have enormous conviction, because they're purchasing something even more valuable than Bitcoin itself. They're purchasing experience. From that moment onward, they are no longer observing Bitcoin from outside the system. They have become participants. That changes everything. Behavioral economists often speak about the importance of having skin in the game. The moment people own even a tiny fraction of an asset, their relationship with information changes. Yesterday, they ignored news about Bitcoin. Today, they notice it. Yesterday, they dismissed technological improvements. Today, they become curious. Yesterday, price fluctuations felt irrelevant. Today, they begin asking why the market reacted the way it did. Nothing about Bitcoin changed overnight. The observer changed. Ownership creates attention. Attention creates learning. Learning often creates conviction. This is one reason why many Bitcoin advocates say the smallest purchase is psychologically the largest one. Not because of its financial size, because crossing from observer to participant permanently changes perspective. Interestingly, many former skeptics never publicly announce this transformation. They simply become quieter. Why? Because the ego doesn't disappear overnight. Imagine spending years arguing against Bitcoin only to quietly purchase some. Publicly admitting the change requires acknowledging that previous confidence may have been misplaced. Many people prefer silence. Instead of announcing, "I was wrong," they simply stop arguing. Then they begin asking questions. Then they begin reading. Then they quietly accumulate. Their friends often notice the change long after it has already happened internally. This pattern isn't unique to Bitcoin. History is filled with revolutionary technologies that followed remarkably similar psychological paths. The telephone was dismissed. The automobile was mocked. The internet was ridiculed. Personal computers were considered unnecessary by many intelligent people. Every revolutionary idea first appears impossible because it doesn't fit existing mental models. Then it appears dangerous because it threatens existing systems. Finally, after enough time passes, it appears obvious. Looking backward always makes innovation seem inevitable. Living through it never does. Bitcoin may ultimately succeed beyond expectations. It may also face challenges nobody can currently predict. No one knows the future with certainty. But regardless of where Bitcoin's price goes tomorrow, the psychology surrounding it has already taught us something profound about human nature. People rarely change their minds because someone wins an argument. More often, they change because reality patiently outlasts their assumptions. Year after year, cycle after cycle, evidence accumulates, curiosity grows, certainty weakens. Eventually, the skeptic reaches a realization that feels strangely liberating. Buying Bitcoin is no longer about joining a tribe. It isn't about proving anyone else wrong. It isn't even about making money. It's about acknowledging that the world may be more complex than they once believed. And perhaps that is the hidden story behind almost every first Bitcoin purchase. Not fear, not greed, not hype, humility. The willingness to admit that certainty can be an illusion. The courage to update one's beliefs when reality refuses to cooperate with old assumptions. In many ways, the first Bitcoin someone buys isn't merely a financial transaction. It's a psychological milestone, a quiet admission that curiosity has finally defeated certainty. That evidence has finally overcome ego, and that the greatest obstacle Bitcoin has ever faced was never technology, regulation, or volatility. It was the invisible architecture of the human mind. Perhaps that is Bitcoin's most remarkable achievement. Not that it convinced millions of people to buy a digital asset, but that it forced millions of people to ask one of the hardest questions any human being can ask. What if I've been wrong? Because history shows that progress rarely begins when people discover new answers. It begins when they become willing to question old ones.